Hello, Dale McDermott here with the CGLCC and welcome to the 2020 Digital LGBT Plus Global Business Summit. Before we get started on the session, CGLCC would like to recognise
CGLCC and welcome to the 2020 Digital LGBT Plus Global Business Summit. Before we get started on the session, CGLCC would like to recognise our presenting
translation partner AI Media for enabling us to deliver live caption translation in 3 languages, English, French and Spanish. And you can access those using the links below in the description box. I'd also like to draw your attention to the left-hand side of your screen to the networking and exhibit hall tabs, where over the course of the next 5 days you can connect with LGBT plus businesses, corporations and each other to help drive that power of connection. And finally, if you do like the content we are producing, please feel free to make a financial contribution using the donate link in the description box below. Thank you. And enjoy your session.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Matthews. I'm a board member and treasurer of the Canadian Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce and director at RBC. Thank you for joining us for today's Fireside session with our special guest, Governor Kate Brown. I will be your host and moderator today. We have a lot to talk about. So welcome, Governor Brown, joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule. So I'd like to just get right into the question because we have 40 minutes. So let's just get to it. And we have lots to talk about. So we'll start off first talking a little bit about you so everybody can get to know about your political journey. Now, as the first openly bisexual Secretary of State, the first openly bisexual governor, you've broken a lot of barriers in your political career. So tell us a little bit about your political journey and also what have been your most effective strategies for being a leader for the LGBT community whilst not being pigeonholed as being a bisexual public figure.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everybody. Delighted to be with you today. It's an incredible honor for me. I got my political journey, it started a while ago. I went to law school because I wanted the tools to achieve justice and equality in this world. And I thought that the tools that a law school education would give me would provide that opportunity. But it was my post-law school career that was really awakening for me. I had a couple of experiences as a young lawyer. I had the experience of being paid less, substantially less than the male lawyer in the office next to me. And I had the experience of going to work every single day, afraid that I would lose my job because I was in a relationship with a woman at the time. So I vowed that if I ever had the opportunity to fight for equality and to end discrimination in the state, that I would take that opportunity. The calling came a few years later. I got into public service because I wanted to be a voice for the voiceless and started as a young legislator many years ago, fighting to end discrimination in the LGBTQIA community, as well as fighting discrimination against women. And we have made tremendous progress over the last couple of decades. I'll say close to 3 decades now. But clearly, we are seeing with what's happening across this country and frankly, across the entire world, that we have a lot more work to do. In terms of lessons learned, I gave a speech as I began my legislative career that I was a bridge builder, not a bridge burner. And I think that's a really appropriate metaphor for the work that we're going to need to do to move this country and this entire world forward. I think for me, I always was committed to working with other folks, regardless of whether I agreed with them on a particular issue or not. I worked hard to work across the aisle. I'm a Democrat, progressive side of Democrat. And committed to working with my more conservative colleagues, both from rural Oregon and conservative folks from urban Oregon as well, our Republican Party. I think the other piece that's been really, really important in my journey is to continue to remain passionate and continue to be persistent about change. And I had a number of issues that I was passionate about, not just LGBTQ equality. I spent a lot of time working in other areas like behavioral health, in women's health. And I think that's helped me not be pigeonholed. And then as I continued on in my political career, obviously worked on a number of other issues as well. So I think my message to folks are to continue to lead with your heart, to continue to be persistent about the change that you want to see. And as Winston Churchill said, never, ever, ever give up.
That's excellent. Thank you. That's a great story about your journey and your leadership capabilities and how you go across the aisle, which is quite difficult, I can imagine, in the States. So I know as you talked and you allude to being engaged in different things, you've always been sort of outspoken in terms of about making sure that more of the economic support measures like the payback check protection program loans in the U.S. go to help women-owned and minority-owned businesses. What has been the success of your efforts, and do you have any sense of how these kind of programs will benefit the LGBTQ community?
So here's what I would say about the work at the federal level to deliver resources to our businesses, particularly our small businesses across the country. The lens that work was viewed was, let's get the money out the door and get it into the hands of businesses. And I think what the Paycheck Protection Act did not do is really focus on how can we build a very quick system that would assist our LGBTQ businesses, that would assist our businesses of color, that would assist our businesses owned by women. And so those businesses, for the most part, particularly our business of color, tend to be not banked or lightly banked. And because the program went through the banks in the United States, for those entrepreneurs and innovators that did not have those relationships with our banking systems, it's been really, really challenging. So my team has been working to connect those businesses, those entrepreneurs with banks by using, frankly, our community-based organizations. So we reached out to our Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, our African American Chamber of Commerce, our Native American Chamber of Commerce to work with them to connect the dots. And has the program been successful overall? Yes. Has it been targeted where it's been needed the most? Absolutely not. And I think as we move forward, we're going to have to figure out ways, and I am focused on how we can deliver resources directly to our LGBTQ businesses, our women-owned businesses, and our businesses owned by people of color. I have limited resources to do that. We're going to focus those limited resources where it's needed the most.
Excellent. So, the current state right now in terms of COVID has impacted many people, many businesses. I know on both sides of the borders, at all levels of government, we are pledging billions of dollars to support our programs for the businesses. Some of the programs are heavily criticized because it's too restrictive. Some of the programs are received well by business owners, but also definitely the government needs to support in the short term. What do you think will be the long-term role of the government to help support businesses?
I think that's a really good question. Our economic institutions in this country, and I can argue certainly in other countries across the world, are founded on racist oppression. And I think we're going to really have to examine these institutions, particularly our economic institutions, to figure out how we can lift up the voices of our underserved, our historically underserved businesses. And so for me as a leader, I'm going to be spending the next several days listening and learning how we can do that at the state level. I think it is about changing faces and ensuring that we have the voices of LGBTQ folks, that we have the voices of communities of color, particularly our African American and Latinx communities at the table, and also, frankly, the voices of more women. And I think when we have these voices at the leadership table, we can create public policy that supports our entrepreneurs of color, our LGBT entrepreneurs, and our women-owned businesses. And so I'm really focused right now on listening and learning, but we have to lift up these voices. These voices have to be at the leadership table if we want to change our economic institutions.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, that's definitely, especially with all the things going on currently, people are recognizing that we definitely need to have a diverse group at the leadership table to make change and effective change. So I think that's great to hear that you are very supportive of doing so and making those efforts as the best as you can in your area. Just on that same lens about COVID-19 and the impact to businesses, because that impacts us here. Many businesses here, and I'm sure in your area, are trying to figure out how to pivot, how to effectively handle what's going on currently. You don't know what's going to happen in the next 12 months. And I'm sure that's similar to any government or public institution. What have you seen maybe in Oregon as best practices of how companies are pivoting, that maybe that's something you can share here, and how are you dealing with the thought of what does 12 months look like?
Well, I just have to say to everyone, I know this is a really challenging time. We're all having to change the way that we function in the world. And I don't know about you all, but I certainly miss hanging out with my friends and my family. So this is really challenging. We're all having to adapt. I, for one, am wearing face coverings when I go outside, not to go for a walk or to go for a run, but certainly when I have to stop at a store or when I am going into an office, I'm wearing a face covering, and obviously very mindful of physically distancing and other activities that we know help prevent the spread of COVID-19. What I'm really proud about here in Oregon is that we tend to think we are a state of mavericks and independent people. We, I think, have some of the country's finest selections of Pinot Noirs and microbrews. We also grow, I think, the world's best cannabis, and obviously very well known for our bicycle-friendly streets. The challenge is, I think, for small businesses, and I think this is where entrepreneurs and innovators can come in. As an entrepreneur, as an innovator, as a small business owner, you have to be resilient. You have to be flexible. You have to make changes in your business model. So one African-American entrepreneur I know, she was doing makeup specifically for women of color. She's made the transition, and she's now making hand sanitizer and other products to help address the needs of the COVID-19 environment. I know a small business owner who sells great books. She is now doing home delivery for parents that need extra children's books during this time. And she's also doing a pickup option. And then Oregon, particularly the Portland area, is well known for our fabulous food. I think it's fair to say we were some of the originators of our farm to table movement, but we're doing drop-off deliveries of our famous and fabulous food products, and other entrepreneurs are doing curbside pickup. So entrepreneurs are leading the way in terms of innovation and flexibility, and I'm sure that's true all the world over. I think for me as a leader, I want to make sure that we have policies in place that support these amazingly resilient, amazingly creative, amazingly flexible entrepreneurs and creators.
That's excellent. That's excellent to hear. Thank you for sharing that. And you're correct, right? It's definitely a time for businesses to try to adapt and look at innovative approaches to survive, and it might find some benefits there for themselves in terms of how they do business moving forward. On the same on the economic lens, and so Canada and the U.S. Share the most mutually beneficial border, I think, in the world. As of 2017, Canada was ranked as the second destination for Oregon's international merchandise exports, and more than 98,000 jobs of Oregon dependent on trade with Canada, trade investments with Canada. Knowing all the different uncertainties that we've had with trade over the last few years with U.S. and U.S. and a few countries, how do you see the new ratified USMCA trading relationship with Canada benefiting Oregon or not benefiting Oregon?
Well, it is my hope that it will benefit Oregon. Time will tell. Obviously, Canada, a critically important trade partner for a state like Oregon. And we're one of the 10th most trade-dependent states in the entire country. So obviously, for me as the governor, it's critically important that we may maintain these economic ties. And also, honestly, I'm really interested in continuing to expand our cultural and educational ties with Canada. For us, 80% of our agricultural products are shipped out of state. We have over 220 commodities. I mentioned our farm to table movement. In addition to wine and hops that we grow to make beer, we are obviously proud of our blueberries and our cherries, our Oregon wheat, and our potatoes. So we have a lot of commodities that we ship overseas. I think what is most important, and as we have gone through this global pandemic, that we've realized, I hope, that we are all interconnected, and that it is so critically important, both from an economic standpoint and from a cultural standpoint, but I would argue also from a health standpoint, that we continue to maintain these ties. And so I'm committed to continuing these relationships. And from an economic viewpoint, it's critically important to a state like Oregon.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to flip a little bit and take a question from one of our audience here. One of the questions that's popped up, like many jurisdictions, Oregon has areas that are very liberal, while other areas are quite conservative. How do you find the balance between expectations of those divergent constitutions, and what techniques or strategies do you employ?
That's a really great question. I think Oregon, we do have some very progressive liberal areas, including Portland, our major city, but we also have communities around the state that are very, very progressive. And we also have parts of the state that are very, very conservative. I think for me in navigating this COVID crisis, my touchstone, my cornerstone has been focusing on science and data, and as opposed to politics. And I know while I do that, I cannot make everyone happy. And in fact, I make a lot of folks unhappy, but using that as a ballast, as a touch point, has been incredibly useful. And then I have brought in medical experts, epidemiologists, to help inform my work, and that's been useful as well. I think there are a couple of things that we've done that have helped reduce the urban-rural divide during the pandemic. Number one is we moved toward reopening. We've done a regional approach. We have had a number of counties throughout the state that have either had 0 or less than 5 cases. So we've let them gradually reopen earlier than our metropolitan areas. So that's been helpful. I think, frankly, relying on doctors' advice has been helpful. And I think my continued commitment to invest in infrastructure that supports rural Oregon, both in terms of the pandemic and longer term, has been really key. Let me give an example. We have communities across the state, some in urban Oregon and some in rural Oregon, that don't have access to the internet. We made a decision last week to make an additional $20 million investment in building out our broadband system. I'm working to pass legislation in our special session to do that as well. But I am absolutely committed to making sure that every single community, that our schools and our businesses and our homes are linked, are connected to the internet. And I know it's probably going to take more time than I have as governor, but that is truly a partnership that I will need rural Oregon for, and I think one that we will all benefit from.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, one of the things I read through about you is your passion to ensure that you are putting together policies and regulation that really reflects your community, the people that you're served. You know, on the same lens, and probably the last topic on this issue in terms of the reopening, and you allude to it a little bit in your discussion there. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to figure out what needs to open, what does not need to open, managing the balance between health and business. How do you balance that? And, you know, knowing that some people want to be open because that's their livelihood, but also trying to keep in mind not spreading the virus.
So this is the first time that most of us have ever been through anything like this global pandemic. And there's truly no playbook for it. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, obviously making decisions based on science and data. We are trying to put the health and safety of Oregonians at the forefront of our work. And at the same time, as you mentioned, we have to balance livelihood, right? And so I would say our reopening phase was a mix of public health and science and data and the practical realities. For example, I know that gyms are probably not the most sanitary place to be. We instituted extensive protocol, and including regular cleanings, limiting the amount of folks that are in our gyms. But we know that gyms are really important. I don't know about you all, but for me, for mental health. And so that has to be part of the calculation. So we included gyms and recreational facilities in phase one of our reopening. And again, it's a balancing act. And leaders are used to doing this all the time. Rarely is there the perfect solution or the perfect answer. We have to balance all of these competing needs. I have to say, I think my governors across the country, my fellow and sister governors, have done an extraordinary job. And I know in Canada, you all have faced these same challenges and are handling them quite well.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to take two questions from our audience here. One, what do you think the future of Canada and Oregon's commercial relations, and what do you think are the products and services that Americans in your states are open to source from Canada?
Wow, great question. And I have to confess, I actually grew up in Minnesota. So I spent a lot of my summers vacationing north of the border, and we still have a family cabin there in Western Ontario on Lake of the Woods. So it is truly a place very near and dear to my heart. In terms of products, what I think is most interesting is the cannabis market right now. And I would just say a couple of Canadian companies acquiring American companies. I think they're very smart. I think they're at the forefront of this new industry, shall we say, at least the legalization of this industry. And so I'm watching that very closely. We've had some challenging dynamics around lumber, and I'm hoping we can continue to wrestle those out in a way that's mutually beneficial for both Oregon and Canada. In terms of other products, I think a lot of it is around technology and infrastructure. I think there's some exciting things happening on the West Coast and the Western region. We have had multiple meetings and multiple events together. And can you share your technology, your creative technologies that you're developing? with a state like Oregon and help us move forward. I know that we're looking at some of your interesting healthcare practices in terms of how do we eradicate substance abuse addiction. And so we're looking at that. But I think there's a monument of opportunities and want to continue this very strong partnership.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I want to switch it a little bit around and talk about some of your politics. In the past, you spent a considerable amount of time in your political career working to make it easier for people to vote, such as with implementing online voters registration and campaigning around using iPads and tablets to help people with disabilities cast their ballots. What measures do you see as priorities now to help before the U.S. election in November, and what kind of things are you working on now?
Well, voting in this country, in the United States of America, is a fundamental right. But we have put up barriers in the last several hundred years to limit access to the ballot for people of color, for low-income Americans, for seniors, for women suffering from domestic violence. It has been very, very challenging. And in my state, we are at the forefront of this work. Oregon was the first state in the entire country to institute vote by mail or vote at home, where people can vote in the convenience and in the accessibility of their own home. They can do it safely during a global pandemic. And it is also extremely secure, and it is very cost effective. So we've been leading the way with vote by mail and vote at home, and we haven't stopped since. We were also the first state in the country to do automatic voter registration. And actually, this is where Canada came in our thinking. I know that you all have what I would consider more seamless voter registration processes through government agencies. We stole your model here. And because of our Real ID Act, we turned lemons into lemonade and figured out a way to automatically register Oregonians who provided their citizenship data to our Department of Motor Vehicles, where we register our for driver's licenses and our cars. And we use that data now to register Oregonians. We now have over 90% registration, which is not quite as good as Canada. I think you're up to 95%, but we're on our way. But the good news is it's enabled us to register more of our historically underserved communities. In Oregon, we believe that your vote is your voice, and every single voice matters. And for me, this is a personal battle. I won my first election to the state house literally by 7 votes. I am living proof that every voice needs to be heard and that every vote needs to be counted. And so that is my mission. And if there are any silver linings from this global pandemic, figuring out how we ensure that Americans can exercise their voice regardless of their race, their sexual orientation, or gender identity, regardless of their income, that we can make it easier and more accessible for more Americans to exercise their voice, their vote. I think that will be a good thing.
Yeah, that's awesome, I think. And I hopefully you, Mayor from Canada, you've taken all the best practices and all the stuff that's failed, that you've eliminated that right away. So as governor, drawing from your experience as an LGBT leader, what do you need what needs to happen to inspire the next generation of LGBT and business leaders?
Well, I think there are a couple things that are really, really important, and I mentioned some of them earlier, but I think they're worth repeating. Number one, I encourage our young people, particularly our LGBTQIA young people, to find something that they are passionate about, right? It can be saving the world, saving the environment. It can be healthcare. It can be figuring out how we address, even much smaller issues at the local community level, but find your passion and follow that. Give it your full heart. Number two, and I think this is really important, and I think one of the joys of, the sort of awakening around LGBTQ equality is to be yourself. and bring the best you can be, and do it with heart. And I think the other piece that's really important is that while we are looking at historic and institutionalized racism, and I will add sexism and homophobia, it is so key to have a diversity of voices at the leadership table. So in our legislative body, we have very few voices of color. We have a few strong LGBTQIA leaders, and we have, of course, a number of women leaders. So where we need to really grow and push ourselves is diversifying the voices of color that are at our leadership table. And I think particularly given our, at this point in our country's history and our state's history, we should be lifting up those voices. And I'm working to do that internally with my team. I'm working to do that externally in the public sphere. But having a diversity of voices at the table ensures that our public policy is more reflective, more resilient, and more, frankly, respectful of the communities that we represent. And I think the results are just better.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and thank you for that advice and inspiration for others. On that lens, we know it's Pride Month all over the place. It might be COVID, and people are doing things more virtually, like our summit now. But looking at the current states of events in both the states and what's happening across the globe, Pride Month, we think of, it marks the event for Stonewall in 1969 and celebrating the community, LGBT community, and the achievement towards equality. Stonewall was a struggle started by Black trans women against police violence and repression of the gay community. And again, once more, they're struggling against police violence that seems to be targeting Black Americans. What are your thoughts on the parallels between Stonewall today and demands for justice for George Floyd's killing, and what can be the different movements learned from each event?
So I think the parallels are absolutely chilling, and I think there's a lot to learn from events of police brutality that happened in our country's history, like Stonewall, and of course the Tulsa massacre. I think what I would say is that it's critically important that we work together, that we bring in our allies in this work. I know for me, being a white woman who is bisexual, that I have worked in the feminist movement, that I have worked in the LGBTQ movement, and that is part of who I am. Now I need to learn and listen from leaders of color and figure out how I can support them and move this anti-racism movement that is happening in this country. I need to help push it along. I need to take a leadership role in certain areas, work that I can do via executive orders. I need to continue to change the makeup of our agencies, our workforce, and I need to continue to work to change the leadership in my state agencies and our judicial branch, which I have an opportunity to appoint. But I think the lessons are, finding allies and working together. In the LGBTQ movement, we worked very closely with our business community, and I'm proud to see voices of businesses around the country stepping up and urging an end to racial oppression in this country. I know that Nike and Columbia Sportswear, two Oregon homegrown businesses, are lending their voice. But what I do know is this: good intentions, strong words are not enough. We need action, and that is what I'm committed to taking, and that's what we're going to do moving forward.
Thank you. I think that's really important when you talk about action. It's the actual action, not just the words, that makes the difference in the change. And I think that shows a great sense of your leadership and your political capabilities of what you're doing. So I'm going to do a shameless plug now. And the chambers, the CGLCC, along with the government of Canada, had organized their first LGBT plus trade mission in the U.S. in 2018 in Philadelphia and Tampa. Would there be an opportunity for Portland and to be a future consideration of destination? Great.
I think we should make it happen.
Yes. I think that would be awesome. I think that's something we want to work with our rest of the board to make that happen here. So let me look at a few questions that's coming through from our panel as well. So I have here, just thanking you, Governor Brown, for your support for undeserved communities. We need more seats at the table, which is just a great thing to hear. And then another question here is, if Donald Trump wins again in November, how can Canadians, how can the Canadian companies work directly with states to ensure diverse trades have at least more priorities and success?
Are you kidding me? If Donald Trump, we're moving to Canada. Are you
You're welcome.
So, I think it's about relationships. I think it will continue to be about relationships. And at the state level, I have a limited role in terms of federal trade policy, but I do have a role in opening doors and connecting people. And I think that's what we need to be doing. Trade, obviously critically important. Love to share with you some of my favorite Oregon Pinot Noir. Obviously, I know you can access Nike tennis shoes anytime. But it's like, what products do you think would Oregonians get excited about? And what Oregon products would you all get excited about? And how can we make those connections? And I find that my meetings, that was pre-COVID-19, right? With your leaders, with your premiers, have been both educational for me and an opportunity to connect our business community. And I think we need to do more of that. And hosting folks coming to Portland, or in return, me coming up to Montreal or Vancouver, I think makes sense. And I think the business delegations are really, really helpful when we can travel more safely. So
awesome. That sounds good. And I think we can share wines. You can look at our British Columbia's Pinot Noir, and we could do a taste testing there and see which is better. So, we're coming close to end. I kind of want to ask you, what are you doing for Pride Month?
Well, Pride Month for me is a chance for us to look back at our history, to really recognize and reflect on how far we've come. I also think it's an opportunity to double down on our efforts. We know that we have members of our community that are frankly targeted for oppression, and I think it's an opportunity for me to double down on my efforts of how can we make sure that we are serving the needs of all of our community. I think that's really, really important. And lastly, what I would just say is it's an opportunity to celebrate. And normally I get to go to fabulous parades in communities around the state. This year, we're going to celebrate virtually. And I think it's an incredible opportunity for everyone to celebrate who they are and to do it safely during a global pandemic.
Yes, for sure. I think so. I think we're all in the same boat. And I think next year, hopefully all well, we'll be celebrating even more in person. So I really like to thank you for spending your time. I know you have a very busy schedule and taking time out to be part of our session here and our summit. I think it was a great conversation. I think we learned a lot from you, and your passion and your leadership and your advice. And definitely want to keep connected, and hopefully we will have our trade mission in your state soon.
I'd love that. Thank you so much. It's been an honor and delight, and be safe out there.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.